Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is so wonderful to be able to welcome you here. As Dr. Sheck and I were talking about just a few minutes ago, we don't even remember the last time that we were able to do this in person. We switched this event. It was one of the very first things we had to do fully remote back in 2020. And it feels like a very, very, very long time ago that we gathered in Classics 110 to hold this event for the 2019 year. It gives me great pleasure to welcome everyone to this year's Chicago Research Colloquium, presenting some of the finest papers that we received about the city of Chicago, prepared by undergraduates across the college in collaboration with and in support of the university's Chicago Studies program. Chicago Studies is really the brainchild of and continues to be very caringly supported by College Dean John W. Boyer, and so it gives me great pleasure to invite him to welcome us today. John.
It's always dangerous to speak when somebody's got their computer here, so I better stand over here. So that's this one. So do we need this really?
Yeah.
Oh, for the Zoom, okay. So I'm delighted to be here. I gather this is the 5th annual symposium. Is that counting the ones that we did on Zoom?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, so this is like the 3rd annual real one, or in-person one, and it's great that we're all able to be here in person. The program that we call Chicago Studies, of which Chris has the honor to be the director and does such a fabulous job directing, is actually embedded. The words Chicago Studies are embedded deeply in the history of the university, because as you may know, the Department of Sociology back in the 1920s and 30s, and the Department of Anthropology and the Department of Political Science, and the Department of Economics all had research programs in which they involved undergraduate and graduate students going out in the city and doing research, and this kind of cumulative product or collective or corporate product of all of this could be called Chicago Studies, or that is to say, studies in and about the history of the society, the culture, the economy, the polity of the city of Chicago, or the metropolitan region. And one of the most important figures in this movement was a guy by the name of Louis Worth, who was a rather important scholar of urban studies. He published an article in the American Journal of Sociology in the late 1930s called Urbanism Is a Way of Life. I think that's the title. It's one of the most cited articles in the social science literature of the interwar period. And Worth was a student of Robert Park and other worthies of the time. And their whole project was to get students out into the city. You know, take a nickel or a dime or whatever it costs to ride the CTA, and go around the city and look at things and see things and meet people, and then come back and tell their stories and analyze their stories and talk about their communities and analyze their communities. And so this is a tradition that's embedded deeply in our history. And when we started some years ago to kind of revive it, it seemed appropriate that we would focus not only on helping students understand the city in a kind of, I would say, a touristic or way, which accumulates. I'm not sure they're doing it this year in the proverbial pub crawl. Are any of you graduating seniors? Is there going to be a pub crawl this year? I guess I don't want to know about that. I want to have a deniability. I always say I don't really care what the students do unless they violate the criminal laws of the state of Illinois, and I think the pub crawl is getting pretty close to that threshold. But anyway, that's a different question. But aside from pub crawls and going up near north with your parents and your friends to eat at steakhouses, so, there ought to be more to engaging the city than that. And I know many of our colleagues use the city through the agency and help of our Chicago Studies program. But I think the work that you've done as individuals and sometimes as groups of students exploring the city in a more scientific, or as the Germans would say, wissenschaftlich way, is, I think, even more, it's more appropriate, in some ways more respectful for the project of what a great city is. Many of the essays that have been presented in these colloquia have ended up being published in more recent years in our Chicago Studies yearbook, which is really a kind of attempt to create a kind of lasting traces of these programs, so that years and years later, people were, like, what was this? Well, the products, at least some of the products of student research, end up in this book, which is published annually and is a Library of Congress number. So it's it's a kind of a scientific publication, but which is good in and of itself, but it's also a sign of the kind of permanency and the durability and the longevity of the program, and kind of putting roots down and then cultivating those roots so that they grow and they prosper. So I want to congratulate all of you who have done this work to produce these essays. It's not easy to engage in original scholarship, especially when you're dealing, as many of you were, with probably communities in which you're writing about living people. I happen to write about the 1870s and 1880s in Central Europe. Those people are long gone, although they have relatives and others who remember. So even there it can be tricky. But I've done a little bit of oral history, and I know it can be challenging, but hopefully you've surmounted those challenges and come up with some really great work. So I'm sorry for the weather. I don't know whether we have a Chicago Studies on the vagaries of Chicago weather, but and your picnic may be a little bit cool. Now, if you waited 2 days, you'd be sweltering, because I gather we're supposed to go from the 50s to the 90s. And I mean, that too is part of the civilization of Chicago. So it's just so there's a seniors' warmest congratulations on having made it and have finished with aplomb and with the success. And to all of you, thank you for coming to this wonderful event. And hopefully there'll be many, many more. So that generations from now, people will look back and say this was an extraordinary moment in the history of Chicago because of the prowess and wisdom and great insight that our students brought to studying Chicago. Thank you very much.
Yes, of course. Good seeing you. All right. And with that fabulous introduction, let's turn things over to our first student presenter. David Owen Carter is presenting his paper on starting a revolution at church, religion, race, and community organizing in Chicago's Puerto Rican community. Dave or Owen?
So thanks to
Oh, sorry about that.
All right, so thanks to Chris and Dean Boyer, and it's an honor to be able to present my thesis. So as Chris said, I'm presenting on Chicago's Puerto Rican community in the 50s and 60s, and how a couple of different organizations were organizing both politically and religiously. And basically in the end of the 60s, there was a big transition away from a more accommodationist organizational strategy to the kind of vanguard revolutionary strategy that you might associate with the Black Panther Party. And a lot of this organization in the Puerto Rican community happened through churches. And so in this first image here, you can see the Young Lords organization at their national headquarters at Armitage Avenue People's Church. And basically one of the big questions that I want to be asking here is whether this is a secular event happening in a religious space or a redefinition of what it actually means to practice religion. So just to start off, I want to kind of talk about the rationale behind this project. I started basically as a project about the Young Lords, which is a revolutionary vanguard organization in the 1960s. Most people think of New York when they think of the Young Lords, but they actually started in Chicago. And a lot has been written about the New York Young Lords, less about Chicago. What's interesting is that the organizer who was in charge of the Young Lords, Chacha Jimenez, over the last decade has produced a lot of the existing archival material on the Young Lords. So there are, dozens of oral histories he's conducted, and then 2 different archival collections in libraries at DePaul and in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And it's kind of unique because he actually has had very personal input into how that archive has come together. And one thing that he clearly cares about when he was creating those was to talk about this organization called Los Caberes De San Juan, or the Knights of St. John, which was a Catholic fraternal group. And what's interesting about them in particular is that a lot of scholarship on them has talked about them as a kind of assimilationist or accommodationist group, which is very different from the Young Lords, which were left-wing, anti-colonial. And so the question is, why does he care about them so much? And so that's kind of one major reason that I wanted to get into this project, is to kind of talk about intergenerational continuity between the first generation of Puerto Rican migrants to Chicago and the second generation, which is the Young Lords. The second reason is that there are various points along the Young Lord story where religion is key, but it seems to come out of nowhere. So for example, the Young Lords started as a gang in the late 50s. And while Chacha Jimenez was in prison on drug charges, he had a religious transformation, which led him to decide to vow to revolutionize the organization. But that religious moment kind of doesn't make any sense within the story when it's told in a secular lens. And so another reason to talk about this is to kind of bring that religion in a through line from the rest of the Puerto Rican community to the Young Lords, instead of just talking about the politics about it. So to begin the story, the Puerto Rican community in Chicago started growing rapidly in the late 40s because of Operation Bootstrap, which was a program in Puerto Rico run by the Puerto Rican government to basically transition the island from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. And one immediate consequence of that was to rapidly rise the unemployment rate in Puerto Rico. And there was a kind of planned displacement of Puerto Ricans, 1 million Puerto Ricans from Puerto Rico to the mainland United States, mainly to New York, but many people also went to Chicago as well. And one of the main concerns was overpopulation, both in Puerto Rico and in New York and in Chicago, and the problems that these migrants were going to be facing. And so basically the needs of the migrants immediately upon their arrival were to find housing, find employment, get access to credit, have access to welfare. And one more overlooked element of it is to reform a sense of community in Chicago. And so an organization that did this exact thing was Los Caberes de San Juan. A lot of people who have written about this organization have kind of talked about it as a community organization in the kind of unionist idea of that in the civil rights narrative of community organization. They were trained, like the leaders of the organization were trained by Saul Alinsky and Nick von Hoffman, who was actually a student here. And their model basically implied that the organization would become integrationist, assimilationist, and that what a scholar, Michael Stoudemire, calls liberal Americanization, which is basically the idea that a group of people can have a sense of nationality, a sense of unique culture, but that that sense of individuality is basically meant to eventually become assimilated into the melting pot of America. And so this has kind of been the normal narrative around the Caberes de San Juan as an assimilationist group. But my argument is basically that you can also look at the Caberes de San Juan as, rather than being assimilationist, being conservative and nationalist, and also based on a Latin American style organization called the Cofradia, which is a Catholic lay organization that basically serves a dually religious and secular function. And so basically you'll have wealthier members of a town who provide money for fiestas, for funerals for each member. And then they also have biblical training classes, mutual aid. So a lot of different mixed purposes in one organization. And if you look at the Caberes de San Juan, they're doing basically almost all of these things that a cofradia would do. And so basically they weren't necessarily assimilationist in the way that you might think if you were studying Saul Alinsky. They're conservative, but they are also very nationalist in the Puerto Rican sense. And so they are not necessarily willing to assimilate to becoming part of American society. And then finally, they're a very huge organization in Chicago. They had 12 councils around the cities and over 2,000 members, which for this type of organization is enormous. Just so you have an idea, the first organization was on Woodlawn on 63rd Street, 63rd Street. Actually, this march right here is along 63rd Street. And then they moved to the near north side by Holy Name Cathedral, Lincoln Park, and then to the west and northwest side as well. And so while the Puerto Rican community started out in Woodlawn, very quickly they moved to the near north, were displaced by Carl Sandburg Village to Lincoln Park, and basically have been moving around ever since. So based on these pictures on the right, you can see the Caberes Fiesta. This is actually on the near north side, a very famous salsa musician. And then you can also see that their aesthetic, wearing suits and sashes, is kind of compatible with this community organizing aesthetic of respectability, but also they have the Puerto Rican flags in the back. They're still all speaking Spanish. They're the concilios, not the councils. And so, that's basically the sense of the organization. So one offshoot of the Caballeros was this organization called the Hermanos en la Familia de Dios, which is the Brothers in the Family of God, which was founded by Jesus Rodriguez, who was a very famous evangelist in Puerto Rico, Catholic evangelist. And he would basically go around the island, living with people, serving their needs, their spiritual needs, mediating between priests and the people. And when he came to Chicago, everyone already knew him. And so he immediately became a famous leader within the Caballeros, specifically in the near north and in Lincoln Park. And so basically, he was determined to create a Puerto Rican run mission within Lincoln Park. And that included things like Spanish Mass, retreats that would, serve people to meet their spiritual needs, meet their, basically teach them how to bring the church out of the church. As he says, the most important part of the church is the exit sign. So the point was to take the hierarchy of the church and flatten it. And so you bring yourself as a leader down to the level of the people who are in your community. And eventually, by the late 60s, he articulated that through the language of revolution. And so he was talking about Jesus as a revolutionary and trying to disassemble this hierarchical model that people normally think of when they think of Catholicism. So another thing to think about Chicago at this time is the second generation of Puerto Ricans who are being born in Chicago and experiencing a lot of the problems that are existing throughout the 60s. And so basically, as African Americans and Puerto Ricans are moving into Chicago, the color line is moving gradually, and ethnic white people who are already in those neighborhoods are basically creating gangs to contest the color line, to fight and basically police which neighborhoods Puerto Ricans and African Americans are allowed in. And so for Puerto Rican young men at this time, it becomes almost necessary to form into gangs in order to defend from that. But the gangs weren't just for self-defense. They're also, to host dances for young people, to do a kind of mutual aid. If you're one person in the gang needs to pay rent, then that's possible. They're also committing small crimes, dealing drugs, but not necessarily to the same extent as was happening in the 70s and the 80s. And so basically, this is the origin of the Young Lords. So Chacha Jimenez, just for context, is the son of this woman, Eugenia Rodriguez, and the nephew of Jesus Rodriguez. And he, his mother wants him to be a priest. He goes to Catholic school, but because he is in the Young Lords, he gets kicked out eventually and is, basically not able to complete his training, even though he really would like to. And so basically what the takeaway is that, young Puerto Ricans were simultaneously, having to join gangs in order to defend themselves, but also were being, supposed to be moral Catholics, young, like good behaved, well-behaved children. And those two things were constructed in opposition to each other. And so he could not possibly be a priest and a gang member at the same time. That's not a viable path. And so essentially this kind of tension that exists between the main dominant organization in the community, which is Catholic and conservative, and the growing number of youth gangs is the Division Street riots, where a police officer kills a young Puerto Rican man named Arcelis Cruz. And there's the first large-scale riot in Chicago for over a decade. The riot is basically, for a couple of days, a conflict not between the police and the gangs, but between the gangs and the community and the conservative community organizers who are trying to prevent them from continuing their rioting. And you have some organizations which are kind of sitting in the back, while the hermanos are actually there on the street saying, putting themselves on the police cars and saying, if you're going to burn this police car, you're going to have to burn me too. And the police end up arresting all of them. And so you kind of can see that there's this three-part structure that's forming. You have the gang members, you have the members of the community who are very conservative, and the hermanos are kind of occupying this middle ground between the two. So this kind of triggers the events that lead to the Young Lords formation. Really what happens, the moment the Young Lords politicize is after the assassination of MLK in April 1968, because Chacha Jimenez happens to be in prison on drug charges at this time, and there are riots all across Chicago. Chacha Jimenez sees a lot of people coming into jail, and they defend him from harassment from the police prison guards. But what actually, the moment of transformation is articulated through this confession that he gives to a priest in the prison, where he promises not to do drugs anymore, and he promises that he's going to politicize the Young Lord. And so afterwards, he leaves and starts building the coalition. And so he makes peace with rival gangs. He reaches out to vanguard revolutionary groups like the Latin American Defense Organization and the Black Panther Party. And they adopt a leftist anti-colonial rhetoric that is very familiar. But the other group that they also form an alliance with is the Caballeros and the Hermanos. And so it's very interesting that they're kind of maintaining, both expanding and maintaining the community. Other people can talk about exactly the chronology of what happens with the Young Lords, but I thought it was more important today to talk about the revolutionary religion that they basically start using. And so to start this, it's important to talk about why the church was even necessary in the first place. And so basically, in order to run any programs with the goal of self-determination, one needs to have both funding and a space in order to have those programs, and that you can do whatever you want with the money that you're getting from whatever organization, and they don't have control over what you do with it. And so basically, this is churches. So they turn to churches in order to accomplish this, especially Protestant churches, which have large endowments, and they're pretty decentralized. And so they can pretty much do what they want with it within a certain limit. And so that's the place that they use to do their free breakfast programs, their health clinics, and do their consciousness raising classes. And all of these are done with the exact kind of hermanos in la familia de Dios philosophy of serving, rather than kind of providing from the top down. And so as a kind of expansion of the family of God, you can kind of see that this is simultaneously very political stand, but also changing the understanding of how the church should be used as a religious organization. There's a quote from Chacha Jimenez where he was preaching essentially and said, "The only saint I believe in is Che Guevara." So, he's redefining revolutionary figures as religious figures. And in fact, it's a little bit hard to see, but on this, on the side of the church, there are several murals of revolutionary figures, including Che Guevara. And you have to keep in mind that the congregation at this church was Cuban exiles, and they did not appreciate that very much. So, taking over the religious space, not for secular purposes, but to reappropriate them for the correct, like their version of what religious space should be used for. Some other things to point out are that the Caballeros actually were fully backing the Young Lords by 1969. Jesus Rodriguez invited the Archbishop of Puerto Rico to come to Chicago and give a mass for the Young Lords. And the Hermanos were basically signing on to every single petition that the Young Lords had. And so the other important thing is that, you know, as I was saying before, one could not be a priest and a gang member at the same time. Well, that's basically what the Young Lords were doing, because they would show up to these memorial services for Manuel Ramos, Ferd Hampton, in their gang attire, which probably only made sense to people in the community in the context of the Young Lords. They would be holding elaborate funerals for their members, just like the Caballeros were doing. And of course, you know, Chacha Jimenez was preaching a lot of the time at the pulpit. And even at Fred Hampton's funeral, Chacha Jimenez was his pallbearer. So you can kind of see that he's adopting this role of not just political leader, but also kind of the aesthetic of the religious leader as well. And so basically, to finish off, the argument here is not necessarily that the Young Lords were a religiously motivated organization, but that all of their political actions can also be seen through this kind of theological lens too. And that there's not really a good reason to look at the Young Lords' actions as purely secular. That when, you know, if you're thinking about, should we fund a secular organization? Well, that's kind of a false line of reasoning, because a church funding the Young Lords might as well be funding a religious organization as well. So this kind of line between the secular organizing and the religious organizing is not necessarily as clear as we might think it is.
Before you release the microphone, we've got a couple of minutes, and I wonder if there are any questions in the room for Owen about his work.
That's a really good question. The connections are there. I would say that Jesus Rodriguez is a liberation theologian. But again, liberation theology, James Cone wrote his book in 1966, which is right before the Young Lords. And I think he was definitely, you know, James Cone worked at the Urban Training Center for Christian Mission, which the Young Lords were at multiple times. And that's actually where they connected with groups like the Latin American Defense Organization and the Black Panthers. And so there is a connection. How strong it is in that, did they, you know, go to a lecture on liberation theology? I think it's more important that they were imitating other members of their community. But I think they're all kind of within the same idea space. Yeah. Yeah, so there are some really excellent resources that have been put together. The oral histories probably were the most important source for this paper. You know, again, Chacha Jimenez conducted all of them, and you know, there's a lot of really in deep. I haven't even, you know, there's no way I could have listened to all of them. So there's definitely more research to be done on it. I also, you know, let's see, you know, it's a lot of comparing and contrasting these sources, trying to find connections between institutions and stuff. But yeah, I would say the oral histories are probably the most important, just because they give you a sense of what people thought they were doing it and why, the way that they're telling the story. We'll have an opportunity for all of our panelists at the end. Thank you so much. Thank you. This would be a great moment for folks who need restrooms. There's one that's just here to the side, and there's another one at the other end of this long hallway. I believe they're gendered, but I don't remember, and it's been a few years since I've been in this building. Our next presenter will be Daniel Green, presenting his paper on Black and White Green Spaces, Segregation, the Specter of Interracial Violence in the Chicago Park District. Give me 1 minute to see if I can find your PowerPoint, and then we'll bring you up here.
Just let me know when I should start, Chris. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Daniel. I'll be talking about my thesis project for the History and Public Policy departments. I was examining the Chicago Park District in the 1960s and the extent to which the late 50s interracial violence in the parks affected the district's decision-making in the city, especially in the 1960s. Thanks to my friends who are here, my family joining remotely. So this project was inspired chiefly by a single document I found in the municipal reference collection at the Harold Washington Library Center run by the Chicago Public Library. The pamphlet is entitled "The Police and Minority Groups, a Manual Prepared for Use in the Chicago Park District Police Training School." It was prepared by a UChicago sociologist in the late 1940s, and it was one of the first major sociological works to address the relationship between police and racial and ethnic minority groups. So my first question was, why was this prepared for a park district police force? I thought, why wasn't it prepared for the NYPD, the LAPD, or Chicago Police Department? And the answer to this question in 1947 was likely the lingering effects of the 1919 race riot, which resulted in 38 deaths and 537 injuries. The riot, in fact, started after a Black swimmer crossed an informal line of segregation at a park district beach and drowned during an attack by a white mob. As the Black population expanded rapidly during the Great Migration in Chicago, public recreation spaces became one of the main fronts of racial conflict as white gangs fought to keep hold of the parks in their neighborhoods, or what they saw as their neighborhoods. As I'll discuss later, this culminated in multiple incidents in the late 50s, including one citywide riot, which erupted from a conflict over Calumet Park in southeast Chicago. So this leads to the question I ask: to what extent, explicitly or otherwise, did these interracial conflicts and violence in the late 50s affect the distribution of park space in the 60s, and how did that manifest beyond that in segregation of existing parks? So this topic has been tangentially studied by scholars from many fields, including history, urban planning, public policy, sociology, and political science. In the field of history, the dominant work was done by Victoria Walcott in the excellent Race, Riots, and Roller Coasters, and additional work by Andrew Diamond, Martha Verbrugge, and of course, Andrew Hirsch added crucial context to how different types of governmental organizations play a part in segregation. In urban planning, William Selecki, Joan Welch, and Paul Gobster had an interesting debate in the same journal even about urban parks and racial boundary zones and whether they function as green walls or green magnets. Paul Gobster, an official with the National Park Service based out of Evanston, considered these parks to be green magnets, meaning that they facilitated rather than hindered interactions between residents on either side. Finally, political scientists and scholars of public policy have analyzed the results and mechanisms of park distribution and segregation, generally finding that by the 1960s, parks were at that point distributed equally among the racial groups in Chicago. So Walcott, Gobster, and these political science findings undergird my analysis. Walcott's work shows the salience that public parks held in this era. Gobster shows the mechanisms by which they were part of interracial conflict, and Mladenka and others show that the space was distributed equally across the city. But most importantly, Gobster's findings seem to be consistent with the assumptions of park district officials. That the park space in between Black and white neighborhoods would be sites that increased interracial interactions and in their eyes, thus increased interracial conflict. So as this was a project for both the public policy and history departments, I used both archival sources as well as quantitative ones. So my archival sources for the qualitative parts of this project were primarily documents meant for public consumption, published by the Park District, but also incorporated the use of internal publications, internal memos, correspondence, and departmental like memoranda, weekly newsletters and things. In terms of quantitative sources, I used the 1960s census to determine what were Black neighborhoods, white neighborhoods, integrated neighborhoods, if those existed. And the park information taken from the annual Table of Parks and Park Facilities. By digitizing each of these publications, which I had found at the public library, I was able to track each open park, closed park, and even the most minute changes in acreage in the years 1960 to 1970. So now to like the meat and potatoes of the historical part of this project. In the late 1950s, several racial conflicts began in the parks, peaking with a 1957 riot that began in Calumet Park and East Side, and ended up spreading to the rest of the city, including multiple other major parks. In 1959, a conflict in Sherman Park in the heart of the South Side, where the growing black belt was pushing up against an ethnic white neighborhood, culminated in a white man who claimed to be a police officer but was not, who proclaimed the park all white in an effort to kick out a black family at a picnic. Several other incidents occurred in these years, but this sets you up with some of the background you need to go into the 60s. So my qualitative results were basically case studies of different parks, different events, different conflicts, things like that. But the first takeaway is that parks officials were meaningfully considering the history of interracial conflict when making policy and park placement decisions. This wasn't, a straightforward thing to show. They never wrote it out on paper saying, we're going to try to avoid racial conflicts by putting parks here and not there. But I believe I did so by combining, different kinds of events, different publications, things like that. In one example, officials deciding, actually, sorry, I'll come back to that. Officials maintain segregation by informally considering a certain park's black and others white. This was best demonstrated by the guidebook to the Lincoln Park Zoo in 1963, which included 2 bus routes in their how to get to the zoo section. However, of the 4 nearly equally nearby routes which were excluded from the pamphlet, 2 served the Black West Side. While not definitive, this, combined with the complete lack of black faces out of the 40 shown in the guidebook and other factors, makes clear that the park district viewed Lincoln Park as a white park, even though it was significantly less than a mile from the nearest majority black census tract and was supposedly classified as a citywide park by park officials. A second example of this can be seen in the attempt to build a new beach in Hyde Park in 1964. The 2 pictures here, you might not be able to see them very well, show 57th Street Beach, which had in 1949 a nearly all white attendance, and by 1964, a nearly all black one. While the story has some up and downs featuring Chicago sociologists as well as comedian Mike Nichols, and which results in the beach never actually being built, I'll try to simplify. The still rapidly growing black population in the neighborhoods surrounding Hyde Park, particularly Woodlawn to the south, had changed the characteristics of the beach-going crowd at 57th Street Beach. And the wealthy, mostly white residents of Hyde Park sought to establish a new beach removed from the black populations to the north and south. The site selected by the Park District, with extremely strong input from the powerful Hyde Park-Kenwood Community Conference, was at 53rd Street, which is as far away as possible down to the block from the surrounding black neighborhoods to the north and south. The details of this case, which more or less boil down to the desires of a powerful local group trumping the needs of the surrounding populace, offer one possible explanatory mechanism for how park placement was decided on the hyper-local level. So I also did this qualitative research where I tried to find whether boundary districts, which I classified as being in close proximity to both majority white, majority black census tracts, whether they received less than non-boundary tracts when controlling for race and population density. And so the answer is yes, basically. Between 1961 and 1965, with a 90% degree of certainty, boundary tracts received less park space. And importantly, in the second half of the decade, the vast majority of new park investment was in the form of tiny playgrounds, usually less than a quarter acre, primarily funded by the federal government through the Model Cities program beginning in 1968. As such, the more interesting analysis in my eyes isn't how much land park acreage census tract gained or lost, but whether it gained one in general or lost one or what. And so this regression shows very conclusively that tracts with high density and those in model cities neighborhoods tended to gain parks, but boundary tracts and those with a high black population did not. And you can see this, I don't know if you actually can see this, but within the model cities neighborhoods, which were Woodlawn and the near south side and up north and Garfield Park, I believe as well, they would only essentially place these new parks in neighborhoods that weren't near the white area if it was a black neighborhood, or weren't near the black area if it was a white neighborhood. So this is not a slide I had in my presentation for public policy or history because this is a very recent development. But beyond the significance of this topic as a historical question, recent events really highlight the centrality of this question to modern issues. While subsequent trends in park distribution may have superseded the lasting effects of the phenomena I document, it's part of a longer history of underinvestment in recreation spaces for Black neighborhoods. After a shooting in Millennium Park earlier this month, Mayor Lightfoot announced a ban on unaccompanied minors in the park after 6 p.m., as well as a potentially extra legal change to Chicago's citywide youth curfew law, moving it from 11 p.m. to 10 p.m. The chain of events is directly linked to the two central questions I asked about the 1960s that do need to be asked now. First, are recreation resources distributed equally to Chicago's neighborhoods? If there were sufficient recreation spots available in each neighborhood, would large crowds be gathering at Millennium Park multiple times every week? Second, is Mayor Lightfoot's framing really any different from the phenomena I've discussed? That is, who is Millennium Park really for? She framed her executive actions by saying that the city cannot allow any of our public spaces to become platforms for danger, implicitly using the same logic of park segregation as safety as officials in the 1960s. Additionally, the action specifically excludes the attendees of Lollapalooza and other festivals in Millennium Park, a concert whose absolutely lowest tier one-day ticket is $125, and which is primarily attended by white upper-class suburban youth. This all leads to the simple conclusion in my eyes that the same logic of segregation masquerading as public safety from the 1960s dictates the modern Chicago Park District as well. So one effect of the extremely elongated nature of Chicago's so-called Black Belt was that an outsized proportion of Black Chicagoans lived in boundary areas. This means that even once we control for the Black population in my regression, the decrease in park acreage in boundary areas disproportionately harmed Black Chicagoans. Additionally, I argue that the effects of racial violence I discuss thus far went beyond the direct harm. At the most basic level, white rioters meant to maintain segregation in the parks which they considered theirs, and to a degree that worked. As I write in my conclusion, this project doesn't purport to address every aspect of segregationist policy taken by the district, nor the full sociocultural impacts thereof, but it does show one way that local government participated in the project of segregation, and it makes an argument to why they did so and why they thought they were justified. Thank you.
Again, we have a few moments for questions.
To what degree do you consider the expansion of historical Black neighborhoods, Black Belt expansion in the earlier 1900s in your analysis, and how that corresponded to park access, in Grand Boulevard, Douglas, Oakland?
Yeah, so I think that actually might be, not to, talk down on my own thesis, but it might be a more interesting question. The issue is I couldn't find the source base for it. The table of parks and park facilities, which was published annually in the 60s, it was very sparse before like 1955. So I wasn't able to do that quantitative analysis. And more importantly, I think there's an extent to which it was just like a more straightforward process. That there was there was very distinct redlining and restricted covenants that dictated the shape of the city, whereas by the 60s that was fading, and these Black neighborhoods were expanding more and more and popping up in the near north side and things like that. So it was a slightly different process, I think, by that point. Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Again, this might be an excellent moment for folks who need to take advantage of the restroom. We have a remote presenter next. These are presenting from Barcelona, and it's going to take just a moment. They were unable to get on the plane because of COVID. Let's take just a moment, and we'll reconvene 122. We'll reconvene at 125, and we'll do that. So Joe, what do I need to do to help Alicia? As a panelist? Okay, fantastic. So I need to find the Zoom.
Hello, can y'all hear me? I don't know if I can hear you, but that's okay.
Hi, Alicia. It's just Chris right now. And ooh,
Okay.
I think I can start my video too. Hang on, then you can actually see me. Nope, I can't.
I can see you through the other
The
camera,
camera?
so we're all good. Yes.
So and you're putting her through the PA now? Okay, it's going to take us a minute to connect you to the PA. We didn't think about how we'd hear you.
No worries.
Otherwise, I could hold a microphone up in front of you, but that just also everyone is watching our chat, which is very exciting. Okay, you want me to mute? I'm muting for just a second, Alicia, but we'll ask you to speak in just a sec. Okay. All right, Joe, I'm muted. Aren't hybrid events great? But you know what, if it weren't for it, we wouldn't be able to have Alicia presenting with us, and I'm so grateful we can. I hope Barcelona is amazing, by the way. Oh. What do we need to do, Joe? What's that? All right, Alicia, would you be able to say hi?
Hello, can you hear me? I also, well, okay. Are you able to hear? Hopefully, yes. I'm going to take this as a yes. I'm not sure if I can hear all of y'all, but hello. My name's Alicia. I am presenting on my paper today, The Wayfinders of Abortion Access, Analyzing the Interstitial Affective Care of Volunteer Case Managers at the Chicago Abortion Fund. I'm not sure if Chris said, but I'm in Barcelona currently, still a little bit under the weather with COVID. So hopefully, I'm trying to enunciate so much right now, but I am pretty congested and just generally stuffy. So I did type up my remarks. So if at any point it's difficult to hear me or understand me, you can visit that bit.ly link and you can see my remarks all typed out, which was also an attempt to mitigate the COVID brain fog situation. But just to kind of, while people are pulling that up, take you through what I'm hoping to do today. I'm going to start with some contextualization, move into my case study, which is interviews with Chicago Abortion Fund, or CAF, volunteer case managers, which sometimes I'll shorten to CMs, which is just what we're called sometimes. And then move into the theory of interstitial affective care / a larger theoretical framework that I drew upon to make this term. Then talk about some case study findings, things I pulled from those interviews, and then finally, it will bring us to my conclusion and some takeaways. So hopefully people who needed to pull up those remarks have pulled it up, and I'll just get started. Just like what Daniel just shared, this contextualizing information is actually not, at least most of it is actually not in my thesis. A major theme of my research is the complex and intentionally confusing nature of the abortion access landscape. So I hope that you can all appreciate the massive changes that have occurred in less than a month of me submitting this paper. As you all likely know, the Supreme Court is poised to overturn Roe versus Wade in mid-June. Experts at the Guttmacher Institute project that 26 states are certain or likely to ban abortion in the wake of this decision, a decision that culminates years of a white supremacist, radical evangelical push to restrict abortion access that has been growing since 2019. So even with Roe in place, for example, last year set a record of an alarming 108 abortion bans in 19 states. So this type of restriction and hostility is not necessarily new. So the Chicago Abortion Fund, as a member of the National Network of Abortion Funds, has deeply felt and reacted to this increasingly hostile abortion landscape. The fund supported less than 200 people in 2018 And an increase in the visibility and public support of abortion funds has allowed for massive growth in the face of these abortion bans, as well as a global pandemic and an economic recession that all impeded upon access to care. And so we think about the fund supporting less than 200 people in 2018. Just this year, CAF has already supported over 2,000 people, distributed over $250,000 to directly pay for people's procedures, and we'll already be onboarding a second cohort of volunteer case managers since I wrapped my research last fall. And at this point in time, CAF is able to fund 100% of the people that they reach on their helpline. So I'm just going to quickly go through these maps that you may see here. So over 80% of the folks that CAF supports are from out of state. And the fund has supported folks from over 33 states this year, many of them coming to Chicago for care. In my paper, I take readers through the different considerations and barriers people face when they're seeking care in Indiana, a state that is legislatively more hostile regarding abortion access versus Illinois. Each state has different considerations such as gestational age limit, private or public insurance coverage, cost differences, and medically unnecessary requirements to access care. Case managers on CAF's helpline must be aware of these state-by-state differences and how they may impact callers' ability to access care. So while Illinois has protections for abortion access in place, there exists this contradiction between Illinois and Chicago as havens for abortion access for surrounding states, while Illinoisans still do rely on CAF for support. And this contradiction encourages us to consider barriers beyond legality that also determine access to care. So just some questions I had coming to this research were, how do case managers grapple with the emotional nature of providing stigmatized support and navigating a hostile abortion landscape? And what can we learn from their expertise as greater threats to abortion access arise? And actually now I'm going to point to the maps really quick. This map on the top here is a projection from the Guttmacher Institute. It shows the 26 states that are certain or likely to ban abortion in the wake of Roe being overturned versus the map on the bottom is CAF's primary service area. So as you can see, Illinois is surrounded by hostile states, and CAF has already been serving people coming from across the Midwest and even Texas. Now that we know that SB 8 has been enacted, folks in Texas are also having to travel out of state for care more often. So yes, basically themes of growth and expanding in the face of increased hostility. So now that we've gone through a bit of context, I wanted to talk about my specific case study of CAF case managers. So for my research, I conducted 1 to 2 hour long structured conversations with the 12 volunteer case managers that worked with CAF during the summer of 2021, and one recently retired volunteer, specifically focusing on the emotion and care work that these volunteers provided on CAF's helpline. And I will interject really quickly that I was also working as a case manager and still am working as a case manager on CAF's helpline. So that was the method by which I accessed this amazing group of people. So the Chicago Abortion Fund, basically the way that the helpline works is that individual case managers will help 6 to 10 people per month access care over 2 shifts usually. And they can provide financial or money, logistical or travel, childcare, et cetera, administrative like referrals or connections to other abortion funds, and as was my main focus, emotional support to those callers. From these interviews, I came to conceptualize the work done on the helpline under the broader umbrella of what I call interstitial affective care. So what is that? Interstitial affective care, I define this as care work that exists within the cracks or interstices of a flawed system. In this case, a racial capitalist settler colonial project that is built on violence, deprivation, and contradictions. This interstitial space is a product of the inadequacies and harms of such a system that create emotional and material needs that networks of care and mutual aid, like CAF, are poised to fill. However, these care hubs are then also only providing temporary crisis responses. So a critical piece of interstitial affective care is a recognition that complete transformation is necessary, and a commitment to this liberatory transformed future also can mitigate the emotional difficulties of providing a scope of care that is simply too small to address the scope of people's needs. So in laying this theoretical framework, I referenced several conversations within the field of critical social theory. I listed them on the slide, but I will kind of delve into two specifically. So first, I referenced the framework of reproductive justice as defined by a group of Black women here in Chicago in 1994. This framework complicates advocacy for reproductive rights specifically, challenging a rights-based approach as it assumes that the singular barrier to accessing care is whether there are laws prohibiting someone from accessing that care. So just to give an example, in the case of abortion, while a stripping of abortion rights undoubtedly creates barriers to access for individuals, a reproductive justice framework asks us to look at the ways in which these barriers impact people of different marginalized positionalities differently, as well as how larger systemic oppression such as wealth inequality, subjection to criminalization, physical proximity to healthcare, and more limit our reproductive choices beyond just rights. So in addition to placing abortion access within larger conceptions of justice, I utilize the term restitutive intimacy as introduced by Eric Clemens, as well as the term, or the concept rather, of emotional labor introduced by Arlie Hochschild to really dig into the affective project I saw playing out on CAF's helpline. So restitutive intimacy was originally utilized in reference to care surrounding FFS, or facial feminization surgery, accessed by trans feminine people. And this restitutive intimacy asks us to consider the larger implications of care, such as histories of stigma, histories of danger, or lack of access, as integral to the emotional experience of accessing said care. So Clemens offers that the care-seeking experience provides healing and offers greater intimacy due to the specific geography of care. When this is extended to the people providing said care themselves, especially in the context of funding abortion at CAF, in which these care providers as case managers have deep political and personal connections to reproductive justice and bodily autonomy, the concept of emotional labor can help us understand the work it takes to counter a potentially hostile experience in which these care pathways are becoming increasingly convoluted and attacked. So while emotional labor is typically applied to paid jobs or to the domestic sphere, it is focused on manipulating one's emotions in order to create a positive experience for those you're providing care to, which can be applied in this volunteer capacity that I'm delving more into. Specifically, Hochschild's offering that emotional labor is not always negative, but may feel negative in the face of a broken, under-resourced care system, is surely relevant as I place case managers' care work at the interstices or cracks of a broken system. As I take you through some of the relevant findings in my piece, these themes of the sheer scope of what reproductive justice will entail, as well as the labor involved in managing emotions while navigating access to care that is stigmatized and shamed, become clear indicators of interstitial affective care work. So my first finding, I talk about a projection of confidence in the face of a hostile landscape. So within this case study, I first note the complexities of the abortion access landscape. So people calling CAF, people who these case managers talk to, face a myriad of barriers that may prevent them from accessing care. A fact that's especially true for race class subjugated and rural communities, young people, and queer and trans people. After recounting an experience with a caller that was experiencing a domestic violence situation, recovering from an unrelated gunshot wound, all in the midst of managing a pregnancy that she wanted to terminate but could not afford to terminate, a case manager I interviewed, Rabia, emphasized that sometimes callers are facing layers upon layers upon layers of need. And CAF organizationally is only able to support these callers in very specific ways. And this kind of gap is deeply felt by case managers who then carry the emotional weight of a system that leaves so many of their callers struggling. Within abortion funding, the specific geography of care means that people who have had or are seeking abortion see their healthcare decisions be debated, attacked, and stigmatized on a national scale. However, due to rampant stigma from a legislative level all the way down to an interpersonal level, even though abortion is common and widely supportive, for some callers who call the CAF helpline, these case managers may be the only people with whom callers feel able to share the full scope of their situation. By simply listening and making themselves available to callers, and this is actually finding number 2, I apologize, I skipped over a little bit in my notes here, but we're on the second finding, talking about destigmatization and affirmation. So just to back up, as case managers may be the only people that these people on the helpline feel that they're able to share their full situation with. By simply listening and making themselves available to callers, case managers are then able to provide care that is more than just transactional. Care that is defined by making space for that person to exist and express their needs fully without shame, and also by sticking with that person until they get the care that they need. Case managers strive to be a positive piece of their callers' abortion stories, even in the face of an abortion landscape that can feel hopeless, frustrating, destabilizing, and confusing, in which the case managers themselves may at times feel hopeless, frustrated, destabilized, and confused. Case managers then manage their own emotions to position themselves as wayfinders of care, there to provide calming, affirming, consistent, and loving support. And I'll point to this quote that I have on the side here from case manager Danny, talking about the tool of listening on the helpline, in which sometimes they're the only person who these callers can speak candidly to about what's going on with them. They go on to say the person just needs to share everything. And I don't think that they need me to fix everything. They just need somebody to hear all of the things that are going on and why it's so complicated for them right now. And this may feel like a small act of compassion or something that anyone would do. But even these small acts of care are super important in creating an experience that combats this larger hostile experience of accessing abortion as it is now, or at least an experience that can be hostile. So just some takeaways from these conversations. In theorizing a model of care that is inherently cognizant of its limitations under a broken care system, and therefore asks us to consider transformation and liberation as true remedies, we can move away from overconfidence and over-reliance on crisis mitigation tactics, such as mutual aid, as things that will fix manufactured scarcity and oppression. But in terms of short-term interventions, the conversations that I had with CAF case managers point to some key takeaways. So the first is general implications for care, in that we should tend towards need-based rather than prescriptive mutual aid care models that emphasize meeting people where they're at and acknowledging their full spectrum of needs, including emotional needs. This also means that we need to resource the places that are already providing the support, such as abortion funds. The next is valuing the perspective of abortion funds and abortion funders. It's important that we regard these people who have been making access a reality as experts in overcoming barriers to care, especially in the face of increased attacks on abortion access. The next is a need for movement-specific support networks. Until true systemic change is realized, resources for collective coping are crucial, including creating support networks for caregivers themselves to process their work. And finally, just encouraging more cross-movement connections, thinking about how this type of care work is not only limited to abortion funding, but also a whole host of liberatory projects that are all intervening in very specific ways to support their communities without being able to necessarily bring about individually that liberatory change that they need to actually support and see their communities thrive. So that is all. Thank you so much. Specifically, I want to thank the 13 incredible, dedicated volunteer case managers I had the pleasure of speaking with, as well as just all the incredible folks at the Chicago Abortion Fund, especially fellow abortion funder sociologists, Alef Bomaraju and Megan Daniel. They really made this possible and mentored me through this whole project. And thank you all for listening. If you are, this is just my plug section of the presentation. If you're looking to resource efforts that make abortion accessible, I encourage you to support the critical care and mutual aid work of abortion funds that is only going to become more crucial after this coming month So if you want to donate to CAF, you can just go to chicagoabortionfund.org and donate there, or you can visit abortionfunds.org to find and support your local fund. And it's good to just know your local fund in case someone in your community needs support. So thank you so much. And I'm going to figure out the tech side of stopping to share my screen.
It's entirely possible that we can ask Alicia questions, but I have no idea how to do that. So are there questions? Do you hear me?
I can hear you. It was a little bit tough with other presenters to hear from the audience. I don't know if the mic is movable, but or if you can repeat the questions. But
I was thinking I could repeat the question for you. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you.
Pass the microphone. Are there questions for Alicia? We should not move the mic. I think I've done something wrong.
Oh no. That's my B. I did suggest that.
To Ruby back there.
I'm not sure I can hear that microphone. I'm so sorry.
Ruby, do you want to just come up here and ask? You might as well get comfortable up here. You're going to be up here in a little bit. Yeah.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I was wondering, as someone who is really embedded in the communities that you were researching, were there results that especially resonated with your experience as a volunteer caseworker, but then also were there results that surprised you or that framed it in a way that was different than your experiences?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So I started this project really thinking about my own emotional reactions to the work I was doing on the helpline. And I think that's what drew me first to really frame this project. Before I even thought about, oh, like maybe I'll create my own term to describe what this means. I came in describing it as emotional labor, and that was how I was framing my work on the helpline. And sometimes people corroborated that in the discussions we were talking about. Sometimes I'd be like, oh, this is a term I'm thinking about including in the paper. What does this bring up for you? And some people, that really resonated with them. They talked a lot about the emotional side of things. But some people had some tensions with that term. And that was definitely a surprise to me, and what encouraged me to think a little bit deeper about the term that I was going to eventually be using. So some of the kind of tensions people brought up were, one, feeling that the word labor didn't necessarily describe what they were doing. They felt like labor maybe felt a little bit negative, or at least didn't necessarily capture the more, I guess, the broader movement commitments they had and motivations that they had for doing the work. And then another thing was that some folks were either adjacent to or involved with just like counseling work, more social services work, and they framed their experience on the helpline as being not only emotional support, or maybe even less of an emphasis on emotional support in many cases, really sharing with me. And this is something that I experienced too, in that the majority of cases, or at least like, I think somebody said in our interview, like half of the cases are super open and shut. You talk to someone, they need a financial contribution, you kind of figure out what that gap is, talk through it with them, and then that's all. That's the length of the interaction. And we talked a lot in those interviews about the fact that even though that seems simple, a lot of the times that extra gap in the last year or two has been something that CAF couldn't necessarily cover. So it takes a couple of days of follow-up and working with the person to figure out other sources to get a gap covered, because that's super important. Organizationally, is just sticking by someone until they can get the care that they need. But that is all to say, people were really emphasizing the logistical pieces of their work on the helpline, or the financial support that they were able to provide, and kind of wanting to balance that with the emotional support piece. And those were all considerations that I was putting into thinking about what interstitial affective care meant for me, and really making sure that it was positioned not as a solution, but as crisis mitigation, and then also as a type of emotional support that was really cognizant of the larger needs that folks are facing on the helpline, and just generally who are experiencing oppression or experiencing material divestment.
Thank you.
Thank you for your
Lisa,
question.
you got a heartfelt thank you from here. Thank you so much. We're moving on. If we could figure, are you feeling okay to join us for the panel a little bit later? I'm not sure if we can beam you in, but we can certainly try.
If it's possible, I would love to join, but I definitely understand the technical difficulties of a hybrid event. So no pressure if it's not possible.
Okay, we're going to do our best. We have 2 more presentations to figure it out during. Thank you so much. Again, let's take just a moment of transition. Our next presenter is going to be Hopi Melton, but I think we need to figure out how that's going to happen. Let me just use the one that's on. Yeah. If you want, I can find you the PDF one.
It's just in your email too, but
Yeah,
if that's
yeah, I
too
can
much,
find it.
that's-
Hopi Melton. Let's see. Is this the one? And here's your
Thank
PDF.
you.
Let's open
I don't
it.
know why the format.
No, it's okay. We'll just miss that
Thank
little
you.
reminder. Okay, I'm gonna pop this up to full screen, which I think
Yeah.
is all I need to do.
Is it supposed to share with Zoom or is it
Okay,
on Zoom?
I don't know. I have no
Or I
idea.
didn't know if the other ones, yeah, if the other ones are sharing screen.
I don't, let's see what Zoom thinks it's doing. I think it's just sharing my desktop, to be honest, but I'm not sure. Let's put this on here. Hey, Joe. If Hopi presents from, oh, yes.
Do we just share screen?
If Hopi is presenting
This is from
from PDF as opposed to PowerPoint, does that mess anything up?
Not particularly, just want to
sharing my desktop.
just share your desktop, but there's also one other thing I want to check here. Hold on a second.
Because I'm not sure if it's sharing right now. but
So you don't have your video stopped. And somehow,
No, why not? But
I want to see something here.
it should be working.
It should be,
Should.
it should be off is what it should be. And the reason is because when video's off, no one sees you at all. If your video is on,
Oh, you
but
get a
some sort
black-
of piece of
black
tape is getting a
screen.
black box,
That's
and I couldn't
super
make it go
annoying.
away.
Oh, And now let's turn it over to Hopi Melton.
Hello, my name is Hopi Melton. I'm a public policy sociology double major. My project is called Emotional Labors, which is very fitting coming after Alicia, who I love and respect so much, and their project is amazing. And I'm also kind of talking about care work, but also labors in the sense of labor unions and organizing. So the subtitle is Organizing Long-Term Care Workers in Chicago During the COVID-19 Pandemic. I wanted to quickly thank my friends who are here, my family on Zoom, my advisor and preceptor, Gray, Pierce, and Sorja Brophy. Chris, you're amazing. Tess is also amazing. It's very fitting. I'm actually, presenting this about care workers and the work that they do. I kind of wanted to dedicate today's presentation, and my project is dedicated to my loved ones who are in care spaces. My grandmother passed away on Wednesday morning. So this is for her. Her name is Jane Buenest. Not all of her care experiences were perfect. And so I kind of wanted to focus on her attitude towards her carers, which was always positive, and she always had, amazing things to say about her care workers. And I'm just so grateful that they were able to keep her comfortable and happy at the end of her life. Sorry. And so, yeah, she's like one of the reasons I was able to come to Chicago and have a great education. So the other person who was able to provide that for me is my mom, who's on Zoom. So I love you, Mom. Anyways, we're going to stop crying and we're going to do it. So yeah, because I've had, so many loved ones in care spaces, I also have loved ones who perform care and who are nurses and working nursing homes. I knew I wanted to write about workers during COVID. I didn't know, what type. And then I kind of cemented my topic after I took a class with Professor Gabriel Wynant, Capitalism, Gender, and Intimate Life, which was like the best class I've taken here. We conducted oral histories with essential workers. This was in winter of 2021. Some of my classmates' ones are the ones I used in my project, along with some more oral histories from a class called US Labor History. So thank you to the people who did those, because that is the reason I have this project and was able to use interviews, which I find, very crucial in talking about lived experiences of workers. And also, obviously, COVID, I feel like changed all of our projects. And I had, we had been hearing the term essential worker be used, a billion times over starting in March 2020. And so I was really curious about kind of the disconnect between what I knew to be really hard experiences of performing care work, especially because a lot of these care workers are of marginal identities, racial and gender identities. So I wanted to kind of explore how that disconnect, was felt and experienced. It's specifically in Chicago, just because of our, long history of labor organizing. And that has always been something that I've studied and have been interested in. All of this, of course, coming with the backdrop of massive historical privatization and profit garnering by hospitals and nursing home corporations since the 70s and 80s, kind of the move away from, government programs and welfare services being funded, well-funded to, kind of do-it-yourself, corporation-based, individualistic, requirements for getting, healthcare and any other kind of care. So that plus wage stagnation and the, really big gigification of work that we've seen, the distance between those at the top and the bottom of healthcare hierarchies has really grown. And I really wanted to see how this played out in Chicago. Also because it is very spatially, racially and socioeconomically segregated city. So that leads into my questions for this project. How are long-term care workers' experiences of work impacted by their marginal racial and gender identities? And how do the labor unions that represent them organize and agitate for solutions to flaws that they have experienced in the healthcare system, particularly those that have been exacerbated by COVID-19? So my theoretical framework, as I'm talking about care workers, but I'm also talking about labor unions, and that is, they're very interconnected, obviously, and I bring them together in my third section, but those are kind of, individual versus collectivist bodies of literature. So Also drawing on Arlie Russell Hochschild's amazing book, The Managed Heart. That's where the term emotional labor comes from. The act of, putting your emotions, your own personal emotions to the side and to the back while you are caring for someone else. She was talking about it in terms of service employees and the domestic sphere. And I'm using it here for healthcare workers. And that was also something that was then racialized and made into something where marginal identities intersected by the concept of intimate labor, which comes from Eileen Boris and Rachel Salazar Pereñas, who are two amazing scholars. They've looked specifically, migrant workers. A lot of these women are Black women, Filipino women who are doing this work. So then bringing in kind of the racial component in order to talk about intimate labor, which is, all types of kind of bodily labor. That was really important to my thinking about this. And then Boris and Jennifer Klein wrote a book about like the history of organizing in care spaces. And they really focused on how the fact that this care work is, considered, dirty or unseen or having to do with the body means that the workers themselves and the patients, I will say, in talking about the elderly, that is not something that was always highlighted in scholarship, that those people are devalued. So that was a really big, important part of thinking about why do we not see any of these workers and why are we thinking about them as essential when we've been neglecting them for so long. So again, that plus the kind of labor union organizing literature, just like the proven efficacy of unions, but also the decreased membership in the US in unions over the past decades. But now the kind of resurgence that we're seeing of the labor movement, especially with new faces, has been really exciting and really important in my thinking. And I kind of saw COVID-19 as this moment that my advisor, Saoirse Murphy, introduced me to this article about protests and political opportunity and kind of like when are the best moments for particular unions or collectives to kind of get in there and make their voices heard. And COVID-19 really, as it did highlight essential workers, I wanted to see if that was actually successful. So yeah, and the third section really just comes and it kind of bridges those two. And especially I wanted to highlight, some literature on standpoint theory and the importance of, using interviews, oral histories, qualitative data, and not using people as data and listening to their stories as valid representations of problems and experiences that they've had. So yeah, so my kind of methodology for this project, I tried very hard to do a lot of cold calling and emailing to try and find interviewees in the Chicagoland area, in hospitals and nursing homes. It's very hard to just cold email a nursing home and say, can I talk to your workers or even unions? It's really hard. That's a lot of bureaucracy that I didn't really want to deal with. And so I kind of remembered and rediscovered the data that I had helped collect for a different essential worker in my class with Professor Wynant, but a lot of other people had done, healthcare workers. I had done not a healthcare worker for mine. So I went to the library because that's where they're stored. They're actually all stored there and you can request them if you want to read them yourself. So I pulled 11 oral histories. I was able to conduct one interview with a physician in a hospital, which is really useful. And then I kind of pulled some content analysis, or I did some content analysis of union websites, communications, in order to learn about like what rhetoric they're using to talk about these issues during COVID of their workers and their marginal identities. A lot of the questions asked were very similar because it was for a project for this class, but a lot of the questions had to do with like, what are people's day-to-day schedules at work during COVID, the feelings that are attached to the label of essential worker, and what changes they wanted to see in their workplace. So that kind of, from that, I kind of coded pretty similar categories about like work environments pre and during COVID, people's personal emotions while they're conducting this work, conflicts that they've had with management bodies, and solutions that they see that they would want to see implemented. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of quotes for these three sections were my three result sections, and I think they do really speak for themselves. The first section is pretty broadly about the personal emotions felt by workers in care spaces in Chicago. their own feelings of stress in their workplaces. I had, of course, expected that. Obviously, we all, following the news in those first few months and years afterwards, we could see how many people were dying and just the endless kind of toll of that. Obviously, I knew that that would create a lot of emotionality, but I was really struck by the hypervigilance and the almost like obsessive nature of that, has to go into when you leave a hospital setting or you are coming into one, the self-cleaning, the protection from, family members, if you are going home to a home with someone else, or maybe someone immunocompromised, that sort of thing. Just that was really striking to read. And then, of course, along with that, the experiences you have while you're in the care setting, like this quote illustrates a patient who only spoke Spanish. So they had a nurse who had to translate the Spanish and say that that this woman couldn't see her husband and could only see him through a glass before he was going to pass away. I think that speaks for itself of not only are you're witnessing this like really emotional and horrible scene every day, all day, but you're also taking on all of those emotions yourself because you care about your patients so much and you care about how vulnerable your patients are in your communities. So like the end of the quote says, that's not the way we want things to go. And that's not the way things used to be. Just the total emotional investment that is completely natural and really devastating when it is, this massive death in all these moments. So that was my kind of really devastating first quote. So I think that kind of goes into my next section of workers kind of seeing having these interactions, seeing these horrible things. And then also, they themselves do not feel bodily protected from COVID-19. There was, a lot of shortage of supplies in these hospitals and spaces. And so that kind of began to create conflicts between either, recognized unions at hospitals and nursing homes, or people who are trying to organize that. Some places in Chicago, I'm thinking of like Rush, did not have a union at this point. So there were a lot of kind of conversations about what conflicts that were arising at their particular health facilities. So I wanted to kind of also highlight, again, going back to the essential worker piece, a lot of these workers really just wanted to say that they were just doing their jobs day to day, and this kind of social conference of value had never been felt, and they didn't really understand why it was. I mean, they knew that they were getting a lot more cases and a lot more particular hypervigilant measures that they had to implement, but that they had never felt valued in their care spaces, and they didn't really see why COVID was, for some reason, this moment for them. And they were saying it's, in this quote, it's saying it was very clearly being used for like managerial bodies of hospitals and kind of higher level physicians who were getting bonuses when they were getting hazard pay, until a pretty abrupt stop in the spring of 2020 of that hazard pay. So that sort of thing of there's this brewing tension that's been there for a long time that is re-arising with COVID. So that kind of goes into the last thing of how unions themselves use the kind of marginal identities of care technicians, nursing assistants, as largely women of color, to organize and try and agitate for change. So I would just say that in the first section, women were not really talking about their status, their gender and racial identity marginality that much, and talking about their own vulnerability in the same way I'm thinking about Alicia's too. It's more about the vulnerability of people's patients that they're more concerned about, and whatever they had going on at home obviously came into these oral history answers, but it was a lot more about, we are concerned about our patients. We are seeing how these hospitals and care systems and governments are failing them. But I would say that the unions like SEIU would really invoke marginal identity of their workers in order to kind of bolster their cause, especially in the summer of 2020. I'm thinking about this quote. So this person is talking about Black Lives Matter and saying the kind of disconnect between other people maybe recognizing social movements, but not always, thinking about how that connects to workers and how that connects to their largely marginal identities. So yeah, I guess we can kind of think about how there were a lot of policy recommendations coming out of unions at this time. And, they always have, meeting minutes that you can go look up that are public that have more of these, policy recommendations about like wage increases or transparency in federal funding, but also other things like alignment with like Black Lives Matter platforms and saying that we need, complete total like a transformation in all of these realms of these workers' lives, like housing security, economic equality, jobs, all that sort of stuff, police violence and abolition. All of the things really came together in these union rhetorics to kind of bolster the cause of healthcare unions, because I think that they did and do see themselves as a lot more part of social movement, like concurrent social movements now than maybe they did before pre-COVID. So yeah, I would just say that was kind of where my policy recommendations for the public policy side of my thesis came from, was the importance of kind of heeding worker-derived solutions, because they know best how care goes well and doesn't go well. And I would say that in most every case, they know best for their patients. And I would, again, any kind of bad experiences, if not all bad experiences of the care, come from these reasons of, lack of resources and that sort of thing. Sometimes there are just really bad things that happen. But that if we did support all of these, lower level care workers who are doing the majority of care work in hospital settings and nursing home settings, I think that a lot of people's lives would be better for patients, families, that sort of thing. So yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Question for both.
So you mentioned that there are like 3 units you're looking at, SIU, NNU, and ASPE.
Yeah.
Do you see like different rhetorical strategies in the 3 units, or are they basically united, how they're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that a lot of them were similar in terms of like obviously the wage increase thing is going to come with any union that you're thinking about. I would say, SEIU represents a lot of unions. The NNU, is an affiliate of the organizing committee, the national organizing committee. They had some pretty particular thoughts that I thought were interesting about like strikes and the necessity of strikes, because they have been on strikes, and then SEIU too had been on the strike at UIC. So just the kind of different employments of like when striking, attitudes towards striking were increasing, not really super different in terms of their recommendations though, because a lot of these struggles are the same across unions and hospitals. But they each kind of, I didn't really go into which ones represent which hospitals and facilities, but I would also say the SEIU, they're the service employees union. So a lot of these are also, they all represent like service employees, but they also really invoked, I had some quotes in my paper about like housekeeping staff at hospitals. So kind of also pulling in other service workers into conversations about, union representation and who are we actually advocating for. Thank you.
We have one more presenter this afternoon. What's that? Yeah, no problem. No problem. And if you give me just a couple of moments, I'll switch over to her presentation, and then we'll invite Ruby up. So again, good moment if you need, if there's biological needs to be taken care of.
So just
Let Sabina know that, would you? Okay. I'm on view right here. Full screen mode. Full screen mode. Okay. Okay, that's okay. I'm gonna stop the share. And then I'll start the share again because that worked last time. No, share screen. Not there. It's this one. Ta-da!
hopefully it's the link.
It is the PDF.
Okay. Can I? Like,
Anything you want, yeah. I don't know how you advance these slides, but, oh, there you go.
okay, sweet. I just want to make sure.
Yeah,
Okay. Wait,
those look
would I
familiar.
have to click it all the way through, I think?
Oh, what a nuisance.
Huh.
Can't go back. You're going to try this?
Yeah, sure.
Flip it around and there's a back button. That's the forward button.
Oh,
Try the back button.
is that?
Back button doesn't work with PDF. I think I'm going back. Oh, and
Here you are.
look at that. It
Thank you
works.
so much. You
Ta-da.
are a superstar.
Wait, today.
Am I allowed to take that mic and
You
wander
absolutely
around and do a
can.
little
Yeah, absolutely.
youth
It's a
pastor
wide-
vibe?
It's a wider. Ruby, we're talk about the question, is
Hello?
there a legal path to environmental justice? Ruby, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Those were 4 very hard acts to follow, but I'm so glad you all stuck around and I'm pleased to share with you my thesis research. Is there a legal path to environmental justice, movement building, strategic litigation, and a case study of Chicago's general iron dispute? So I like to start with an outline so you all know what's going to happen. I'll talk about my motivation for this project and give you all a little context, talk about my methodological approach, and go over results from my literature review, talk about my overall findings, and finally review some recommendations. So I think to start out with a question on my slide that I suspect most of the people in this room know the answer to. But as you folks probably know, environmental injustice occurs when environmental burdens disproportionately harm already marginalized communities, but also when marginalized communities aren't involved in environmental decision-making that impacts them. And it's key to, I think, a lot of what we do here in the Program on the Global Environment and in Chicago Studies. And really, I think that there's few better places in the world to study environmental justice than Chicago. And that's because it's been a cradle not only of environmental injustice, but also of creative movements towards environmental justice. The Southeast side in particular, which is the area my thesis focuses on, has been subject to more or less any pollutant you can imagine: manganese, pet coke, coal dust, lead, cyanide, to name a few. But at the same time, the widely recognized mother of American environmental justice, Hazel Johnson, is a native Southeast Sider. And groups like People for Community Recovery have emerged on the South Side and become leaders in how we define environmental justice in America. And so it's really an incredible place to live and study if you're interested in these topics. And that's kind of why I took this approach, to ask big questions about environmental justice at the movement and national scale, but to ask them in the context of this place that has seen so much environmental injustice and seen so much organizing. So to start, I think that when we do this kind of research, we have an obligation to make it relevant to real people doing this work in real life, because this is not theoretical research. And so I focused on what was an ongoing case study when I began this research and was resolved actually over the course of this research, which is General Iron. So as many of you are probably aware, this General Iron plant was a metal shredding recycling plant that was originally in the wealthy, predominantly white Lincoln Park neighborhood. There was explosions, lots of noise complaints, and a major citizen movement to have it out of there. But where things go when they are forced out of Lincoln Park is very often the Southeast side, where cumulative environmental burdens are the norm. And so the plan, with the help of the city, General Iron's parent company, RMG, was going to relocate the plant to the southeast side, just streets from 2 different public schools by residential areas and commercial strips. And as you can see on the top right, this led to a really incredible grassroots movement that unfolded over several years. It involved litigation in the form of civil rights complaints and administrative litigation that got the EPA and HUD involved and to investigate the city. It involved hunger strikers. It involved youth writing op-eds in national publications. This movement put General Iron on the map for the nation and forced national outlets to cover it. It was really incredible to watch. And then recently, actually about a month ago, Lori Lightfoot, under tremendous political pressure, as well as investigations from federal agencies, agreed to deny General Iron its permit. And so it's no longer planned to be relocated to the southeast side. So that brings me to my research questions. First, what is the role of litigation in today's environmental justice battles, especially on the southeast side of Chicago? And second, what legal strategies are recommended by both the track record of environmental justice litigation in the courts and the needs of environmental justice grassroots movements as reported by organizers? And so as you can tell, I'm kind of steering into the law territory. I'm really interested in how litigation operates as a tool within movements, but also is often this sort of gate-kept space, right? It's a place where you need to have a law degree to bring a case. It's a place where we litigate things at the national level and where we decide who has rights and who doesn't. And so I've been really curious if litigation can help grassroots local movements, and if so, how can lawyers organize their work and organize their cases around serving local movements rather than just thinking like lawyers? So to talk a little bit about my methodology, open up my thesis toolbox. So really there's 3 main components to my research. I did an extensive literature review, mostly of literature from the 90s, which is when scholarship on environmental justice litigation really kicked off. And I wanted to understand what strategies had been tried, how they'd worked, and how lawyers and legal scholars were thinking about environmental justice, A, as a movement in America, and B, as an area that they work in as lawyers. Secondarily, I interviewed 10 lawyers, activists, and plaintiffs, many of whom, about half of whom, were involved in General Iron specifically, and others who had a national perspective. And I analyzed each interview for recurring themes and patterns, which became my results section. And then finally, I put all of this through the lens of the General Iron case study, which I really want to stress exemplifies many of the most concerning environmental injustice issues we face in America today. It involved in polluting industrial development in a majority minority neighborhood next to schools and a residential area. It reflected the movement of a plant from a white neighborhood to a low-income community of color, which is something that happens all the time in environmental injustice. It was also a case of air pollution, which is really hard to litigate because you can't see it and you can't hold it. And so the faster that we can think of legal frameworks to understand air pollution and litigate it, the better. So for all of those reasons, I think General Iron is really interesting, and things that we can understand about how the General Iron movement worked and ultimately succeeded will help us understand and strategize for the future of environmental justice in America. So I want to talk through major findings from my literature first. There's a lot of text on the screen. There should be less text on the screen. If you could just listen to me and not read the words, I would be very grateful. So the main takeaway from all this literature in the 90s, when people started to write about environmental justice as a legal theory, is an enormous dose of skepticism. And I think coming out of law school, one of the main things that you learn, I'm just guessing because I'm an undergrad, but is that the law is a really, in many ways, fundamentally conservative institution. In lots of ways, it is designed to keep things the way they are and to keep the rate of change of our society at a slow enough rate that the courts and that politicians can keep up with it. And so that led to this really tremendous cynicism in scholarship, saying that these are lawyers and legal scholars saying, like, dear environmental justice movement, don't rely on us. We can't win in court. Which is jarring, right? It felt, reading the 90s literature, like environmental justice litigation was dead in the water. And I have to say, they weren't wrong. Environmental justice litigation has not achieved enormous success in the courts. And I'll go into a little bit more of that on the last side, but the main thing you do need to know is that even laws that are designed to help people fight against discrimination have mostly not worked for environmental justice cases because of the mandate that plaintiffs prove intentional discrimination, which is almost impossible in environmental justice cases, because it's really hard to prove that a city or a company wants to hurt the majority minority Southeast side. In fact, it's a case of them trying to defer pollution and defer problems to a community with less political power. And making it hard to prove discrimination actually wound up finding one of the civil rights cases in the general iron complaint dismissed because they were unable to prove intent to discriminate. And like I said, lawyers are, modestly self-analytical. And a number of them said, these scholars in the literature expressed concern that because environmental justice law emerged out of environmental law, where people deal with trees and chemicals and not people and justice, it was fundamentally patronizing and needed to take more cues from civil rights and poverty law, which deals with people and their stories. And so taking all of this together, I was also able to glean some of the key strategies in recent domestic cases. And I'm just going to boil it down to three main ones. First, state constitutional claims. There's a number of states with a right in the Constitution to a clean and healthy environment. If you're an environmental justice activist, it sounds great. It sounds like you're guaranteed to not have a plant in your backyard. Unfortunately, these state constitutional provisions are subject to limitations by state assemblies and courts. So in a lot of cases, they haven't been effectively leveraged for environmental justice. The good news for General Iron, for the Southeast side, is that Illinois' state constitutional right to an environment, which we have, has been limited in some ways to only apply to people and not to ecosystems, for example, but it hasn't been limited in ways that currently prohibit people from bringing environmental racism claims under it. So that's still a really open legal field. We have civil rights and equal protection. So this is relying on the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Movement was a major impetus for environmental justice and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And these are laws that are designed, they are written to help people deal with situations like this, where decisions by politicians disproportionately impact marginalized peoples. And these laws are on the books to prevent things like General Iron from happening. And they've been rendered almost useless in the courts because of the mandate that plaintiffs prove discriminatory intent. The type of racism that operates in most environmental racism cases that go to court is simply impossible to prove was intentional. And so can't stress that enough. There's never been a successful equal rights or civil rights or equal protection case on an environmental justice issue. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem that there's likely to be unless the Supreme Court relaxes those requirements. Finally, the public trust doctrine, which originated in Illinois, actually protects public lands, mostly ones that used to be underwater. So that one's a little loosely interpreted, and traditional environmental law with a twist. And so this is a broad category. It's basically referring to everything that's not the first two, where people are pulling from laws that are not traditionally at all tied to environmental justice and trying to use them creatively in an environmental justice context. And there's been some success here. A great example is of a development in California, where there's a mandate that you hold a certain number of community meetings. The community meetings were held in English, but the community that would be impacted was predominantly monolingual Spanish speakers. And so environmental justice lawyers successfully sued to require them to do the community meetings in Spanish. And so that type of thing, using zoning laws, policy laws, laws about how development has to work, and then applying it to an environmental justice case, that can be pretty successful. So I want to preserve their anonymity, but I also want to introduce you to my 10 interviewees briefly. I spoke with 2 attorneys in a General Iron civil rights complaint to the EPA that was focused actually on violation of the Fair Housing Act. I spoke to 2 General Iron organizers, 2 other Chicago-based environmental justice attorneys, I spoke with one of the plaintiffs in a different general iron civil rights lawsuit, the one that was struck down because of failure to prove discrimination. I spoke to an NRDC environmental justice policy expert, the head attorney for Our Children's Trust, which is an organization that focuses on youth plaintiff cases around the country, which you've probably heard of, especially Juliana v. US has become a really famous case. Young people standing up for the environment in court has become a really popular recent trend. So I spoke to that attorney as well as a youth plaintiff in the Reynolds v. Florida case, who's now in their early 20s, but was part of a case against their state's government on climate change grounds. Okay, y'all still with me? Yeah? Okay. So I have 4 main takeaways from my interviews, which again, I sifted through and coded for recurring themes. The first is that both activists and attorneys expressed that the key role of litigation in environmental justice movements is as one small piece of the puzzle that is essential, but no less essential than any other. And that attorneys are at their best when they let activists be the drivers in these movements and take their cues from activists in terms of what kind of litigation will be strategic. What I also heard again and again was that people broadly felt like the General Iron case was a really good example of this. Like attorneys did their job, they attended community meetings, and they took advice and guidance from activists. So I have a quote from a plaintiff here speaking about her engagement with her lawyer. She said, "And so that's what I loved about the work that we did. We were allowed to have the voice that made sense to us." So another key finding I had, and this is something I really did not expect to find, but that came up a few times in my interviews, was that the civil rights movement of summer 2020 was a key catalyst in the General Iron movement. And I have a great quote from an activist here who said, "At the time of George Floyd's murder, General Iron was reaching a breaking point. What does this mean when we say Black Lives Matter or when we can't breathe? What does this mean for our neighborhood?" That's when we really got into the General Iron campaign. And to me, as an environmental historian, that was really interesting because it parallels the early development of the environmental justice movement, which came after predominantly the 1960s civil rights movement. So if anyone talks about that after my presentation, I would love to. Third finding was that despite all that skepticism from the 1990s, because litigation was failing in courts, what everyone I spoke to said is that lawsuits can help even when they don't succeed in courts. They bring political attention, they bring media attention, they bring a degree of authority because these are spaces that are gatekept and attorneys have a position in society from which they are allowed to advocate. And I have an attorney here who said, "You've got to fight with everything you've got. Not winning in court doesn't mean losing." Another attorney also told me that they had a friend in the mayor's office and that Rahm Emanuel would say the F word every time General Iron was on the front page of the Tribune because it meant bad press for them and it meant more political pressure. And that's political pressure that ultimately convinced Lori Lightfoot to deny General Iron the permit. So litigation helps, even in ways that I think are surprising to lawyers who are primed to think of as a win as a court win. So the major takeaway here is that lawyers need to let activists lead the way for environmental justice litigation to serve the broader movement. Based on this research, the General Iron seems to be a good model of how these movements can work and should work, and could be looked to by other activists and other attorneys across the country. Another thing that didn't quite make it into the presentation, but I want to make clear, is that we talked about how law is one essential piece of the puzzle, but I want to make sure I also name the other essential pieces. So something that I heard again and again, I didn't interview any minors because it's a complicated research area, but every single person I spoke to essentially said that youth were unspoken drivers of this movement. They protested, they participated in the hunger strike, they wrote in national publications, they were hyper engaged. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. And people also talked about journalists who did investigative environmental journalism work. Maxwell Evans, who writes for the Herald and Block Club Chicago, comes to mind as he uncovered a lot of this stuff. This was really an effort by people across Chicago. And it's something that has been incredibly inspiring to me. And I hope is something that people in New York and San Francisco and in small towns across the country look at. So finally, this is something that didn't quite fit into my, what I'm now sure is overtime presentation. But like I said, I would think that research like this should come away with a concrete recommendation that helps people in the real world doing this work. And so after conducting my literature review and talking a strategy with a bunch of attorneys, I came up with the rough outline of a possible case for the next time something like this happens on the Southeast side. And unfortunately, another key thing my interviewees told me again and again was that it will. They're already gearing up for the next battle. So this legal recommendation is that because litigation is successful, not necessarily when it succeeds in courts, but when it creates enormous political and media pressure, a media-focused lawsuit that harnesses the power of youth, who right now are a largely unseen part of the movement, but in fact have this remarkable charisma and unique stake in their community. So harnessing them as youth plaintiffs in a claim that takes advantage of Illinois' still open environmental right, but that also combines it with more traditional environmental law so that it can stay in court longer and have a better chance with judges who are primarily familiar with that traditional law. So read my thesis for much more on that, but that's the outline. If I have time, I'd love to thank people. So grateful, Chris, thank you, and all of the faculty at PGE and Chicago Studies. Sabina was my advisor, but has also been a professor and mentor and boss over the past 4 years. And she has created a space at PGE that has felt like an intellectual home, and I think has really immeasurably made my college experience better, but also everyone else who's come through the program and people who pass through classes, even if they're not majoring in environmental and urban studies. So I'm just incredibly grateful to Sabina and my peers who have challenged me and inspired me all through the past 4 years, and who I can't wait to see what you all achieve. I'm so glad to be going into the world with you all because it makes me feel more hopeful. I don't think my parents are watching, but they made me, and they are my favorite people in the world, and they made all of this possible, and I'm forever grateful to them. This is a really impactful quote. I wanted to be on it while we took questions. You can read it. Need this.
And, okay, so
Not entirely sure.
well, I would like to invite all the speakers up here, and then we'll figure out the technology.
That's right. Yeah. Ooh, wow, that was really powerful. If our presenters could again join us for a few moments of panel conversation, that would be great. Little unsure how the tech is going to work here, but we'll do our best. And Alicia, if you're out there, we hope that you are able to join us, but I don't know if you're there. If so, turn on your camera. This. So panelists, when you have the opportunity to answer a question, make sure that you're speaking into that microphone.
And are there questions here somewhere?
I was told that there are questions out in the world somewhere, but I don't know where they are.
Chat. Oh, here we go.
Yeah, try that. I see a heart. Okay.
Okay, Evan Carver.
Oh, yes, absolutely. There she is. Hi.
Oh, well, maybe someone else can read Evan's thing, then I can close this so we can see Alicia. Is that okay?
That's perfect, yes.
Okay, somebody, Joe or someone can read Evan's question, or we'll just skip Evan. No. So hi, everybody. Ruby already introduced me way too kindly, but I'm Sabina Scheck, and I'm the, among other things, the faculty director for Chicago Studies. And I have not been asked to speak, just to facilitate the Q&A, but let me just say a few things really quickly. One is thank you to Chris Scrabel and Tess Conway. Tess is gone now. She's setting up the party, so that's good. We'll be ready to go. For just creating such a supportive environment for students who want to do research about Chicago and faculty, and for fostering this amazing research that we just heard today. So thank you to Chris and Tess and the entire Chicago Studies team, who not only do that, but do a ton of events. And their intern team is amazing. So thank you to all of you for your scholarship. I and to Alicia, who's on our screen here. I just have to say that I learn more about Chicago every year from reading these 5 to 6 final theses. I feel like many of you feel like this with COVID. I can't remember very much about the last few years, but if you ask me anything about Claudia Cassidy, the arts critic for the Chicago Tribune, I know because I read the thesis like 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and the author of that thesis is now the arts critic for the Chicago Tribune, which is amazing, right? So I remember so much and I learned so much, and it gives me an opportunity to read things that are not just about environment, but they're all connected. So thank you, everybody. So let me just ask you this. So Hopi actually reminded me of something that I had, I guess one of those things I had forgotten, but Hopi told me in her first year, she was in my class, Ruby was in my class, I think Alicia, you were in my class, and one of the assignments in the class was go to the Chicago Studies Prize Colloquium. And I don't know if you all went, but it's amazing that you're all here now and that you're here now too, Owen and Daniel, and I just wanted to ask you a question to start is, how did you get here, right? From your first year here at the University of Chicago, I don't know how many of you are actually from Chicago. How did you get here from that first year? It was probably a bumpy, winding, COVID-filled road, right? So how did you get from when you got here to this culmination of this really important Chicago-based research? And I don't know who wants to start with that question, but.
So, I mean, I've been taking classes on Chicago since before I knew there was a Chicago Studies certificate. Just because I was really interested in it. I'm from DC, so I'm really interested in, like, you know, cities and comparing them, and especially their history as a history major. But I will say I think the class that made me the most interested in this topic was Adam Green's History of Black Chicago, which was one of my 3 classes for the certificate, and really set me down this path. I originally was going to write about, I think, like the CTA or some other kind of investment along race lines, and just kind of stumbled headfirst into this topic at the public library. So I guess that's my story. I don't know.
I'm a little bit of a latecomer to the Chicago Studies program itself, but I took a few classes with Nicholas Kritska about schools in space, and he has an oral history class, which was actually probably the single most the thing that made me continue going with the most, because I was in a group focusing on Puerto Rican bilingual education, and we conducted a few interviews like Belmont Craig and Jefferson Park. And so that was kind of like the first time in an academic way that I was kind of getting out and doing stuff in the city. And so, I think that's kind of how I ended up here.
I was also in Adam Green's class with Daniel. That class I think should be required. He is an encyclopedia of knowledge, and I took that class. We took that class right before COVID, and so then we went online, and I just started taking a bunch of Chicago classes. I will also say that first COVID summer, I interned with Chris in Chicago Studies when it was even smaller than the team it is now. It's so much bigger now, and it was just so cool to see like what resources are out there to research the city and what organizations are doing amazing work. And last thing I'll say is I like with Alicia, and they can speak to this like a lot better than I can, but I kind of got more familiar with what organizing happens on this campus and what happens in the city, like teachers and unions and all that sort of stuff. So that kind of cemented me wanting to do something about work and labor and the people that we leave behind. So, Chicago is like my big city, because I'm from Richmond and St. Louis, and they're cities in their own right, but Chicago is like the big city for me. So it's very exciting to be here and hopefully to be here for a long time.
And as I said, Professor Scheck and Anastasio and Carver guided me through the city as much as they did through courses at this school. And so that was huge, coming to U Chicago and finding environmental studies and realizing that what I had been putting into activism and writing back home could translate into an academic career as well. And that was really exciting. And I kind of found a love for interviewing and oral history through an environmental justice communications internship with the Field Museum last summer. And that was just a very cool way to talk to people across the Calumet region about the economic and ecological and cultural history of the area. And then I think the other key part of my story here has been journalism, writing for the Hyde Park Herald and the Southside Weekly, as well as our student paper, The Maroon, of which I was editor-in-chief for a year, about environmental justice and establishing environmental beats, has allowed me to talk to so many just incredible activists and parents and teachers, and to see where those boundaries collapse and overlap when we're in a crisis, and to understand neighborhoods that are frequently in a crisis. And so I'm just very grateful to everyone I've had the chance to speak to and interview, especially those that have stayed in my life as friends, and people I'll write about in the future. So yeah, they all brought me here.
Great. And Alicia, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can y'all hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Beautiful. I can answer briefly. I kind of, the first experience I had in Chicago, I was able to speak to Damon Williams from the Let Us Breathe collective, as well as just the artists and creatives there, and really became aware of a Black abolitionist tradition and like really deep organizing roots that exist in the city. And that kind of opened my eyes to the really amazing organizing history of Chicago, as well as the things that are happening in the present. So I got looped in with Hopi, doing abolitionist work on our campus in Care Not Cops, and also through my abolitionist organizing, as well as I taught for a bit, did like a youth theater program where I got connected with Megan Jaifo, who's the executive director of the Chicago Abortion Fund. And I think that both like my abolitionist kind of background, or at least like my emerging abolitionist background, as I was learning so much from Chicago organizers, as well as thanks to the CSGS and Bonnie Cantor for giving me the resources to be able to intern at the Chicago Abortion Fund. I really like honed in on my own liberatory analysis, and just really began to learn about the city from people who I respect so much and who are really working to make change, and to provide care and love and support within their communities. So super big shout out to all of my Care Not Cops comrades, and as well as all the people who I've been able to absorb so much from in my organizing journey.
Great, thank you. I mean, it's so inspiring to hear how you've all turned activism and organizing into research and scholarship, and how you can take that back to your roots in activism. So thank you for all of you for that. I have a whole bunch of questions, but there's more people here who have questions. And I first wanted to give our presenters the opportunity to ask questions of each other, if you would like. You have the floor. Any of you want to ask a question of each other? I know Ruby already asked one of someone, but don't feel obligated. We have many people with questions, I'm sure.
I will ask. I am not a history major, and I am very interested in history. I don't think I would like study it or anything. I'm kind of curious, like how you got to your topics / I know you have to kind of pick a time period to do history, like for your major and everything. So kind of how did you get there specifically, and then how did you know that like within that you wanted to talk about Chicago and the topics that you did?
Okay, so I came in as an econ major and then quickly dropped that after taking a very interesting history class called History of the Present with Kathleen Ballou, which kind of introduced me to a way of thinking about history as a like very concrete thing that shapes the present. So I mainly focused on modern American histories, like World War II on, specifically around urban and racial issues. So when I was thinking about writing a thesis, I immediately started looking at Chicago because we're already here. There's a million archives and no better place to study those issues. And I mean, I kind of mentioned it, but I literally stumbled into this thing at the Municipal Reference Collection at the Public Library that was this weird sociological work from 1940 whatever, and really just turned me onto this issue of, this is like a really important public resource that no one's really written about other than Victoria Walcott, and she wrote about it in the context of the civil rights movement specifically. So just like finding a question that I didn't think had been asked in the research led me to the topic and the time rather than the other way around, I think.
I've been a history since my second year, and I've just kind of liked history a lot. What brought me to my thesis in particular is that my partner is Puerto Rican, and I was actually living with her family right at the beginning of the pandemic. And the point, I was taking Professor Kritz's class at the time, but the thing that made me kind of interested in Puerto Rican history in Chicago specifically was the urban unrest of the summer of 2020, which was very like real. And so that kind of got me interested in the Division Street riots. And so that's kind of where this project started.
So can I open it up to questions? I can give the mic to anyone.
Just a quick follow-up on that, though, because what you just spoke to something that actually I've been wondering. I think we've all talked a lot, and even in the middle of today's conversations, I leaned over to Sabina and said, we could ask them all about how COVID affected their research. But actually, I'm more interested in how the racial reckoning that hit our city in a really palpable way influenced your trajectories and your research and even the commitments that you brought to that. I feel like, we did a Chicago Futures series last year, and we talked a lot about COVID. I don't think we talked anywhere near enough about the still very open wounds of segregation in our city and the ways in which racism is encoded itself. A lot of your projects touched on it. I just wonder if folks would be willing to speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I can start. Because I didn't really know what I wanted to do within labor organizing and organizing in Chicago. And then I would say summer 2020 and going online really solidified wanting to talk about essential workers. I will say that then this is in my paper, but I talk more about a little bit about medical racism and like racial segregation of the city impacting quality of care. And how that interlocks with, these, patients, people of color, poor people in the city of Chicago are being cared for by these nursing assistants and technicians who are also, have basically are the same, demographics of the people that they're caring for. The most people doing the most of the work, I would say, are these like care technicians. And so, then when I kind of incorporated the union piece, I was just seeing a lot more about how these unions were showing up at protests and they were in the streets and they were, I would say that knowing a lot of union history about Chicago, they haven't always been inclusive and sympathetic to, radical politics in terms of apart from like radical class politics, with separate union locals for Black members and that sort of thing. And women just totally left out. And so kind of seeing that change, even in 4 years, like with what CTU has done and these, healthcare unions have incorporated abolitionist frameworks into their principles, I would say was so interesting to me. And I just really thought that that was like, even in my 4 years here was a big change from what, coming in 2018 after, seeing a kind of CTU strike on the end of Rahm's term that was really intriguing to me. So I'm not sure that answers the question, but and then just like my own organizing really like shaped what kinds of, not theories, but like ideas and frameworks I was bringing in. Again, Alicia can talk a lot more about that, but just really making me think about my own place and my own privilege at UChicago as this institution with a very troubled history of how it has treated our Southside neighbors. I think has just, yeah, really shaped my thinking in everything that I do. So that's a long answer, but.
Yeah, I think I've always been interested in environmental justice, but as I mentioned in my presentation, I think that the 2020 civil rights movement put an incredibly fine point on it in Chicago. In particular, something that emerged through my research that really grabbed onto me was people's frustration with a city that vocally supported the Black Lives Matter movement and vocally was proud of its diversity, that was continuing to make decisions that the Southeast side is predominantly Latin, but that disproportionately harm Black and Brown communities. And so that was one thing that became, I think, a far bigger focus than it would have been otherwise. And additionally, I was really struck reading histories of the environmental justice movement and how in the past, abolitionist work by civil rights activists has been followed by waves of environmental justice advocacy that are in some ways enabled by the path sort of charted by broader civil rights movements, which bring political pressure and attention in the media and attention in the public to issues of racial injustice. I'm thinking particularly of Bean versus Southwest Waste Management, which is the first environmental justice litigation in the US and happened in Texas. And it followed immediately after Houston's major civil rights protest of the 1960s, and was a really remarkable rom-com, actually, because an expert witness in it was married to the chief lawyer, and they went on to found lots of environmental justice theory. But yeah, that's a little bit of a story.
Alicia?
Yeah, I can speak to some of the things. Also, sorry if it's a little bit loud. But I think something that really I sat with a lot while I was writing my thesis, but also not just my thesis. I mean, I was working with CAF and kind of seeing the increased hostility of the abortion access landscape play out in my day-to-day just at work as well. And I think that it's important to point out that abortion bans and restrictions are forms of criminalization, and there are ways in which the state exercises very specific points of power and surveillance on people's bodies, on their own decisions to do what to do with their bodies, and the fact that it's not a uniform experience. I mean, these abortion bans, they're enacted kind of on a statewide level, right? So when Roe falls, states can choose, or states can enact abortion bans kind of on a state-by-state basis, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is not going to have access to care. It just means that care is going to be a lot harder to access. And in terms of racial justice, we can think about the fact that race and class play a lot into the intergenerational wealth, like the way that your community can support you in terms of resources to get you from point A to point B. We can think about the ways in which, I mean, I know we're not talking about the pandemic, but we can think about the economic, I guess, implications of the pandemic in terms of people losing jobs, people not being able to, I mean, just the economic recession in general. We can think about how that all has like a race component to it, and it does fall harder on Black and Brown communities and Black and Brown people. And I think naming that, also there's like very annoying bell tower in the back, which I guess is just a Spain thing, but it plays like every 30 minutes for some reason. I'll just end with the fact that this connection between abortion justice and the criminalization of bodies is not only something that I'm thinking about on a structural level, but also on an individual level. And we think about SB 8 in Texas, how this law is deputizing people to criminalize their neighbors, to criminalize care providers, and really makes people have to think twice about providing care and providing because abortion is healthcare, abortion is just a medical procedure, but it forces people to think twice about providing care, as well as puts a level of criminalization and shame on the ways that we're like policing each other's bodies. So I feel like there's a lot more that I can say in terms of just generally the way that like a liberatory focus, just through picking things up from abolitionist spaces in Chicago that really ramped up during the uprisings of 2020, and that I became really close with organizers in Defund CPD who are really calling for a movement of resources. But I would say kind of two things. One, like the way that we're seeing care being criminalized in terms of abortion access, but two, and I didn't actually talk about this, but I'll slip it in quick at the end, is the fact that abortion funding is all about resource distribution. And we can think about the ways in which resources are being put towards funding police, funding militarization, and being systemically divested from communities of color and from care and schools and things that our communities need to thrive, including abortion access. So that was a bit of a ramble. It's getting kind of late here, so I'm hoping that I'm able to cook it.
Well, thank you for that, sticking with us, Alicia. Yeah, and I think we need a whole other panel discussion here because there's so much to say about all of these things. So I don't know if we probably are out of time.
We fortunately have a party right downstairs
Yes.
that we can continue all of these conversations.
Okay.
Unless there's a urgent last second question.
Bring your questions to the party. And I guess I'm introducing our next presenter, our final presenter to present the Chicago Studies Undergraduate Research Prize is the Deputy Dean of the College, Dan Kohler.
I don't think I need there as it is. Hey, so good afternoon, everyone. So I've really enjoyed listening to all of these presentations in the Q&A, mostly through the live feed. And it's been completely evident over Zoom the unique qualities that each of these different papers brought out, and the unique sort of insights and commitments and experiences that went into the creation of your theses. So I wanted to congratulate all of you on that. It really sort of shows through in your work. So one of the questions that always occurs to a prize committee or an editing committee for a journal has to do with the thoroughness of research and the kind of doggedness that you show in pursuing leads and trying to find out the answers to questions. And if the data isn't immediately there, then you go after it, or you find different ways to answer that problem or illuminate it. And that was a quality that really is evident in all 5 of these presentations today. So congratulations to all of you. And that's one reason I would like to offer to publish all 5 of your essays in the 2022 Chicago Studies Annual. So I will follow up with you, and I hope that we get to work together on that in the near future. Now, the committee always has a robust and lively discussion in trying to come up with a winner. And there are very good arguments to be made for each of the different presentations that we've heard today. But this year was unique in that the committee honestly couldn't come up with a winner for all of its efforts at tie breaking. So this year, for the first time, we've decided to award the Chicago Studies Undergraduate Research Prize to 2 of our finalists. Okay, so without further ado, our first recipient for 2022 is Owen Carter. And I want to note by way of explanation that the committee was very impressed by the depth of his sourcing and archival research, and the multi-layered storytelling that went into his account of Puerto Rican community organizing in Chicago, and the way that we ultimately see an interesting outcome to the story that is theorized, where there is ultimately an interrelation of faith and politics that spans across religious lines, but in ways that don't leave religion behind at the end of the story. So congratulations, Owen. It was a joy to read you this. Now, our second prize winner also explored movement building, but this time in the context of the environmental justice movement in Chicago and indeed across the US. Ruby Rorty's essay is grounded in a very present day case that is with us right now with the proposed relocation of the General Iron plant, but has also interrogated almost 4 decades of legal theory and environmental law to offer a set of very optimistic and forward-looking recommendations. And the committee was very impressed by the creative synthesis of different kinds of evidence and that quality that I mentioned, the forward-looking nature of the recommendations with possibilities for future organizing on behalf of communities that are impacted by environmental injustice. So please join me in giving a big round of applause for Owen and Ruby as the winners of the 2022 Chicago Studies Undergraduate Research Prize. And finally, for all 5 of our presenters today.
Events, even awkward hybrid ones, do not happen on their own. We owe an enormous debt of gratitude to our AV team who made everything possible today, including improvising on the fly to make sure that Alicia could be with us for this entire time, which was such a treat. I really think a special round of applause to Alicia for hanging in there from Barcelona with COVID to participate. I am so sorry that you will not be able to have a drink with us after, but I promise you that there will be some left over. So when you're back, just look us up. And for everybody else, last year we inaugurated what we call the Chicago Studies Garden Party, and then we realized that we were just being stupid because the motto of the city is Urbs in Ordo, City in a Garden. So why not call it a City in a Garden Party? Still almost the same party. Basically what it consists of is a whole bunch of coolers and a whole bunch of food. It's all pretty much directly below us, so you have to walk by it on your way out. Please do come down, and if you are somebody who completed a Chicago Studies BA, we have a tote bag for you. One last word of thanks is, yeah, it's in the Cloister Garden. As far when I came upstairs to start this event, it was going to be in the Cloister Garden, which is pretty much right downstairs. If it's freezing outside, they may have moved it into the library lounge. So we'll all find that out together. And when you get down there, please thank your bartender. That is Tess Conway, our assistant director. She is so busy setting up food that she's not here to receive those thanks in person. So please take a moment to thank her for her incredible work individually. Thank you for your incredible work and for joining us today. You do the college proud and you make us a better institution. Oh yeah, we'll do that at the party. Let's go. Thank you so much, Alicia. I so appreciate you hanging in with us. It was so wonderful to have you with us today. And I can't wait to meet you in person.
Yes, true. Everyone have another drink for me.
Please thank Isabella. Thank Isabella as well, because Isabella's paper was extraordinary as well. It made me cry.
Oh my goodness, I'll let her know.
Speedy recoveries and safe travel to you both. When can you come home?
Monday, right?
Monday?
We're coming back on Sunday, actually.
Okay, well, we'll see you at graduation.
Yay,
Yes,
we'll see you
okay.
next week, in fact.
Bye.
So great to see you. Thank you.
Hey Chris, I just wanted to tell you I was able to see it from my office.
Oh, how wonderful.